So we'll get started. Hi everyone, my name is Birgitta and I like creating documentation. And it was not always like that. There was a time in my career when I actually had to sit for days at a time, not writing any code, but writing Word documents. I think a lot of my Word skills today come from that time. And in hindsight, probably writing a lot of things in that document that was basically just rewriting what I had written in code in human language. But I have not touched Word in months, and I haven't touched it in years to create documentation, so I'm documenting very differently today. But saying that I enjoy creating documentation does still feel a little bit like a secret confession, because there seems to be a stigma attached to this topic. That's why I'm also really glad that so many of you showed up. So one way maybe to visualize that stigma would be this. So this is a web search for software architecture diagrams. And another way to represent the stigma would maybe be this. This is from the table of contents of a 500-page book on visualizing software architecture. And it contains words like templates, release strategy for documentation, and architecture document. So those are all terms that developers in the Agile era that we're in today kind of makes us shiver. Gives us goosebumps, but not the good kind. And in the 2011 second edition of this book, it actually had an epilogue that contained 4 pages on Agile. And what they did in that epilogue is they also reprinted the Agile manifesto with its 4 main value statements. Of course, one of them being that we want to value working software over comprehensive documentation. And so from what I've seen over the past few years, it feels to me like this sentence seems to have interpreted by many to say, in Agile, you don't do documentation because it's waste. So developers would say things like, docs are outdated as soon as we create them anyway, or our code is self-documenting, or documentation, like what, UML diagrams? But if you're in a similar role as I've been in the past few years, maybe as a technical lead on a team, or you're maybe one of the more senior developers on your team, or just in general, you're just a thoughtful developer, you might be thinking things like this. The team needs to share a common understanding. Or, I just heard Alice explain that complex thing again. Or, why did we choose technology X again in the first place? So the intention of the manifesto-style phrasing of A over B, actually what they meant by that was that while there is value in the things on the left, we value the things on the right more. So while there is value in documentation, we value working software more. And we definitely value working software more than comprehensive documentation, like those Word documents I used to write. So documentation is really quite a vast area, and to me it's basically about describing our software, and it can be a lot of things, like describing what it does, describing what the structure is, how to use it, how to build and install it, and in this presentation I will actually focus on describing the technical aspects of software, and also how developers, how we use it to communicate with each other and some of our direct stakeholders. And I'll also focus on documentation actually on a higher abstraction level. So there are certainly ways to use your code to describe your software better, to make it more intention revealing, and also your tests, but I will not go into that. But this presentation will be all about the extra text and the extra visualizations. So as this thoughtful developer, you might then be asking yourself, but how much is just enough documentation? So where are you on this spectrum? Are you dealing with a system on the very left where you don't have any documentation at all? Or are you on the other end of the extreme where maybe you have UML diagrams with 1 box for each of the classes in your code? Or do you have what I just mentioned, code that you would describe as self-documenting? So it's quite easy to get into it by reading the code and maybe by reading the tests as well to understand what the software is doing. And how do you find a good point on the scale? Because there's so many things in between that. So I'll not be able to tell you exact rules and a definition of what just the right amount of documentation is. As with so many things, unfortunately, in our job, it depends. But I'll go through some of the different reasons why I find documentation helpful and give you examples for each of those. Because whenever you're looking to balance things, a good way to start is always by making sure that you focus on the value you're creating, why you're doing things, right? Before jumping directly to the artifact or solution you have in mind. Because one reason that's definitely not a good reason to create documentation is just for the sake of a process, and a process that tells you that you have to create certain artifacts. So the truth is always there. It's in the code. So what purpose does it have to draw and write up further documentation, further description of your software? So I'll start with the maybe most common one. You use it to create a common understanding in your team. Because we often think we have a common understanding, but actually in our heads, we all have different pictures of what the system is. And by surfacing this, putting it on a whiteboard, putting it on paper, we can realize what those differences are in how we're thinking about the system. So we're kind of like, oh, you actually thought it was a square, I thought it was a triangle. And then you can work together to actually complement your knowledge about the system and also clear up the misunderstandings to come up with that common picture. And you can actually literally do it like that. You can have your team together in a room, maybe even break up into pairs or groups. Each group prepares kind of a picture of what they see, what they think your architecture is like, then get back together, present each other what you did, and see where the misunderstandings are and where maybe you complement each other's knowledge. So the way I like to think about this is, or what I like to do on a team is kind of create a wall of common understanding. And one of the most important aspects of this for me is to give yourself a space constraint. So if you have the luxury of being co-located with your team, it could actually be a physical space on your wall, and you could say, okay, I'm going to use 6 A4 sheets of paper or 8 A4 sheets of paper or something like that. And the reason why I think this is important is that because as humans, we can only keep so many things in our heads. So the things that you really want everybody to have in their heads, they shouldn't be too much, because we just can't keep it there. So this would be then filled with everything that I believe everybody on the team should know about the state of the system we're building. So the contents totally depend on the project, but what very often ends up on that in my teams is usually a systems overview with dependencies, maybe what's around there, frequently a component and tech stack overview. If your environment setup is very elaborate, maybe you want to put that up as well, but if it's really easy to just see that from maybe the continuous delivery pipeline you have, then maybe you don't have to put that up because there are other places where you can easily learn about that. So things that usually trigger in me that, oh, maybe we should put that up on that wall, see if there's still space, is what am I always explaining to new joiners in the team? Or what do I often need to explain to our stakeholders to give them a high-level overview of what's going on? Or what terms are used in the team a lot, so we should all know where those terms sit and what they mean. And also what does not change often, because this stuff should be the stuff that doesn't frequently change. And ideally, this is a success if maybe every few weeks or so, one of the developers goes up, takes a pen and corrects something, or maybe recreates one of those things. So the second value add I want to talk about is to surface and understand complexity. So this is about things in your system that are maybe not as high level as the things I just described, but things that are not trivial, yet critical. And maybe you don't even touch them that often because you built them in the beginning. So one thing I like to use for that is infographics. So this is actually an example of from a team where we were building an offline-first web application. So there was a lot of complexity in things like how we were storing the data, how we were syncing the data between front-end and back-end, stuff like that. So in this case, we actually also had some of these non-trivial things up on the wall. And so I'm using something that I call infographics for stuff like this, because they're more like things that you probably can't just put on a slide or in a drawing and then at a glance somebody can understand what it's about, but you need a bit more explanation, so you shouldn't be shy to actually mix text and visuals here. And you know, it's okay if people need some time to look at this and read this, but this is still a lot better than having a Word document describing this. Another thing this gives you is also to check if things are simple enough. So in this case, I actually didn't build this solution. And then we worked together as a team after the solution was built and tried to come up with a graphic like this. And that way we could all understand it better and also made sure that it actually made sense, that there was a pattern, that this was the right way to go. So usually things that would trigger me to think maybe we should have something like that is, like I said, complicated things or complex things that you don't touch frequently, but every time you touch them, you're having a hard time remembering what exactly it was about, and to check if things are simple enough. Another thing I once used, another aid you can use to facilitate the explanation of non-trivial things, is what I would like to call a widget kit here. So this was a set of paper widgets, so index cards, printouts, stuff like that. And in this case, we created it to help us explain our data model and its history. So it had sketches of our screens and index cards representing our data entities. And then we could actually use that whenever we needed to explain this to build up a picture step by step with these widgets. So I think this is really useful for things that have a lot of history or that have a lot of things attached to them that is a little bit hard to put in writing. Maybe in writing there would be a lot of things between the lines that somebody would have to know. So in these cases you would feel better to have a conversation about this instead of giving somebody just an infographic. So things where you also feel like the step-by-step helps the understanding. And understanding actually brings me to my next category, which is to use documentation to create empathy. Because in this case, actually, this data model kit, we used it because so there had been a very strategic decision done in this particular company for a database technology that was quite important to them, but it was causing a lot of problems, specifically for our team and our use case. So we really needed an effective and efficient way to bring across our requirements and our problems to people when discussing this technology. As often with discussing database technology, there was a lot of emotions going on as well, and we actually had to explain this a lot, and sometimes like every 2 months or so when the decision was revisited. So this really helped us. Another form of empathy you can create with documentation is actually empathy with each other. There's a really nice Medium post by Duretti Hirpa, she works at Slack, about empathy-driven development. And in there she talks about building an empathetic code base. So something where you apply code reviews that has maybe scripts to automate things and any other tools that will provide context, including documentation. And she says that by creating documentation, we show and create empathy for our fellow teammates and create space where people feel guided and safe when changing software. So we're actually, she's saying that when we're working on software without guidance and without documentation, it's actually quite anxiety-producing. And especially if you're maybe a more experienced developer, we often forget about that because so many things we take for granted, and we forget about what it feels like when you get thrown into a new system and there's so many things that you don't know. Another form of empathy you can create by describing your software differently is between product people and developers. And I don't know how often in my career I've heard developers complain about product people not really understanding the software and how it actually works. Admittedly, including myself, I've complained about that. But I have not seen so much effort from the developer side to bridge that gap further. And I just want to give you one example of what we used on a project where we needed to generate PDF documents. And if any of you have ever done that, like generate documents automatically, it's really hard to really have that layout nailed down so that all the human beings using this will say, oh, this is a beautiful document. So every few days, one of our beta users would come by and say, oh, this page break, like where you're breaking the page, this is not nice. There's only one sentence on the next page, or this doesn't look good. So we actually took the predicate logic we had in our code to implement this page break logic and put it up on a poster. And we used this to discuss with our product owner and sometimes our users if it was actually possible and if it made sense and what the trade-offs were to introduce a new rule into this set of rules. So it can help you show complexity, to help discuss solutions, and also show others what the scope is actually to help them see the effort the team is having. There's somewhere on the internet there's this big diagram showing how Slack decides to send a notification, and it's actually quite a big thing. So it created empathy in me with the Slack developers. So I would maybe think about creating something like this when there are a lot of bugs for a feature that are caused in misunderstanding of the functionality, either by the PO or by the users, or for complex functionality like this with lots of predicate logic, where you're having a hard time as a developer communicating about this with people who don't read the code. So the next one is using documentation to help our future selves make more informed decisions. And in this one, I want to talk about architecture decision records. So recording decisions today that will help you make better decisions in the future. And there was a blog post by Michael Nygaard, the author of the Release It book, already more than 5 years ago, documenting architecture decisions. And in there, he's saying that one of the hardest things to track during the life of a project is the motivation behind certain decisions. And without understanding the rationale behind decisions of the past, we only have two choices: either blindly accept them or blindly change them. And both of those choices are not really ideal. We don't want to be blind, right? So to get you started with this, there's actually a nice little tool that helps you maintain markdown files to document your decisions with the Nygaard recommended structure of context, decision, and then describing the consequences. And you can then version those markdown files with your code. And there's other tools to do this. You can even do this in a Word document, or a lot of commercial wiki solutions out there have features for this, actually. But the medium is not so much the problem here in my experience. It's more getting ourselves to routinely do this super valuable thing and deciding what to document here. And I've been thinking about why it is so hard, even looking around for maybe is there a cognitive bias that would explain this, but I haven't found one yet. Maybe one of you knows one. But I guess it's because usually when we've come to a decision, it gives us this nice closure and we just want to move on and implement that decision, right? And not just sit down for another 2 hours and write down what we just discussed. So it also seems to be hard to recognize the moments when you should write something down. And then when I think about that, I think about the fact that this is about architecture decision records. So it all comes down to what we think architecture is, and obviously discussing this would kind of blow up the scope of this talk. But whenever I ask myself this question, I revisit a very nice article about defining architecture by Martin Fowler from 2003. And in there, he says one thing that stuck with me in particular. That architecture is the things that are hard to change. And I'm currently trying to get better at recording these types of decisions, and this is what I usually think about. Will this be really hard to change later? Also, was there a lot of discussion in the team about this, and it was kind of painful to come to a decision, because if you had two kind of strong points and you had to make a decision between the two, there's a very high probability that that other option will come back up again, like a buoy on the water or something. Like 2-3 months, somebody will bring it up again. And if then you don't remember why you had a good reason to do it differently, then you might just flip-flop back and forth between two different solutions. So the final value add I want to talk about is creative problem solving and how documentation can help you with that. So one of the things neuroscientists tell us we know about the brain is that the two halves are responsible for two general types of thinking, right? The left side being analytic and the right side synthetic. And when I drew this picture, I realized this wasn't very scientific. It's actually so left. So let's have this figure look at a giant smart mirror. So left half analytic, right half synthetic. And so this means that the left brain is generally responsible for our written and verbal skills, and its thinking is more linear and rational, whereas the right brain processes by looking at imagery and patterns, and it's more suitable for addressing complexity and ambiguity, and also seems to contain the centers of creativity. So why am I telling you this? So I recently read up about this stuff in this book, The Back of the Napkin by Dan Rome, and it's about solving problems with pictures. So, and the title also has this notion in there that you might put those pictures on napkins even to highlight the aspect that they don't need to be for eternity, those sketches you make, and they also don't need to be particularly polished to be useful. So the process of creating them helps you think differently. It can help you solve a problem. And vision processing apparently appears to take place equally on both sides of the brain. So if you apply active visual thinking, that might activate both your analytic and creative capabilities at the same time, and you might see new solutions. So some of you might be thinking that I'm digressing a little bit, maybe, talking about visual thinking. Am I really still on the topic of documentation? But maybe it's not documentation in the classical sense, having these whiteboard sessions and stuff like that. But I feel like maybe the reluctance to record software descriptions because of the bad rap that documentation has, and our focus on working software and avoiding waste, that sometimes maybe prevents us, without even us noticing, from going through these valuable exercises. And a lot of desks on your in your team might actually already look like this, with all these like sketches around. And then maybe if you find yourself drawing something for the 10th time, maybe you can actually make that into something more permanent. Yeah. And in Dan Rome's book, he also has this part where he says the hand is mightier than the mouse. So he talks about the value of doing this really by hand, using a pen and paper and not the computer. One reason for this is that people actually like seeing other people's pictures, so it makes them more receptive to the learning and the information. They are quicker to create and easier to change. So it can be like a constant trial and error process. And also with computers, it's sometimes really easy to draw the wrong thing because there are so many built-in functions and charts and stuff like that and shapes. Yeah. Another thing I learned from this book that I use quite frequently is that he has this visual thinking process lined out where in the first 2 steps you actually collect all the information you have and then put it all out there to look at it all at the same time. And I do that quite frequently when I have like a hard nut to crack or something. I try to take all the information I have, the current solution, and just look at everything I have, and it sometimes triggers new ideas. So I just went through 5 things that through 5 value adds that documentation can give you. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are some of these things I feel like are maybe underutilized in software development. So this was using it to create common understanding, to surface and understand complexity, to create empathy for each other, reduce anxiety, but also maybe have better conversations with your product people, to help our future selves make informed decisions by recording today's decisions, and also help you with creative problem solving. And depending on your project, you might have very different priorities for these, depending on the leverage mix in your team, so how senior is your team, the type of software you're building, the type of stakeholders you have, is it greenfield from scratch or is it a legacy application, which phase of the project are you in, so this can be very different. Of course, the most frequently asked question with regards to documentation is, but how do you keep it up to date? Yeah, this whole thing, oh, it's outdated anyway as soon as I create it. So the good news is, some of it you don't really have to update. You should continuously record your decisions, for example, but the ones you took in the past, that was like kind of shot of the moment. And also what I just described with the creative thinking, those things actually, you shouldn't get too attached to those things. You should just throw them out. Then you also don't have to update them, right? So they've served their purpose. But for everything else, like how do you keep it up to date? You probably don't. So there is generated documentation, but that only works to a certain extent, also with the benefits that I just described. But in the end, everything that is not necessary to keep your software running runs the risk of ultimately being out of date to some degree. So just a few recommendations, maybe. One is just to have as little as possible. Like what I described in the beginning, for the high-level things, maybe set yourself a constraint, how much you actually want to have. Also constantly groom it, throw stuff out you don't need anymore. And the second thing is to try and make a lot of it very visible so that you always see it and you just walk by and see, oh, that's not right anymore, just take a pen and update it. Because if it's buried in some wiki, the chance is a lot higher that it gets outdated because you never look at it. If you never look at it, maybe it also means that it's not useful. And the last thing is maybe find ways to include updating this or working on this in your rituals that you have as a team. For example, maybe you have like a weekly developer huddle where you get together and talk about different technical topics, and then you can also look at some of these things. Or maybe you have like a biannual like tech day with your team where you just have like a reset and look at what your architecture currently is, and then use those things that you created to learn about this again, and then also update it. So, short recap. So, I wanted to talk about what can help you decide how much is just enough documentation. And I went through 5 kind of purposes that documentation can have that can give you value. And then I went through some examples as well. And maybe to summarize those, the way I see them is, so the truth in the end is in the code. That's the real truth. So additional things you might create are things like maps kind of describing what you have. So those could be high-level system overviews or more low-level things for the important complex things, and also maps for tourists, like tourist maps or for non-coders. The second category would be how-tos, things like readmes. I still see so many code repositories that don't have a readme. Onboarding checklists, troubleshooting checklists, kind of all those things that can reduce anxiety and give everybody a better feeling of what's going on. And then you have things that describe the history of the software. Things like those decision logs that I talked about, or spikes. So when you have done a little technical experiment to learn about a technology, write down what you learned about it and why it's suitable or not. And also you have your Git commit history or your version control commit history if you're not using Git, of course. And there's actually some good talks and blog posts out there as well about how to write good commit messages so that when your colleague who was on vacation for a week comes back and reads your logs, it actually sees what has been going on. But ultimately, all these things, you should never aim to, never is a big word, but here I actually dare to use it. You should never aim to create your documentation so that somebody from the outside can read it and understand everything they need to know without talking to your team. Because then you probably put some waste in there. And you're also very rarely, I would think, really in that situation. So the team is always the guide. They are the guides who use all these things to explain to people what's going on. And finally, maybe a few principles that came up through the examples that I talked about. One is to constrain the space and the limit documentation, but think about the value as well that it gives you. Groom it constantly and build that into your rituals. More hand, less mouse. And this is actually also, I sometimes feel like maybe people are being put off by creating drawings or stuff like that, because then there's so many rules out there how you should do it, like which level this should be, which direction the arrow should go. Maybe sometimes just throw that out. If it helps you in your process, just still draw something. It doesn't have to be perfect. So it's okay to have ephemeral, like temporary documentation and just throw it out afterwards. It can also give you value sometimes. And the last one is something that I personally actually still struggle a little bit with, because I like doing this so much, like finding creative ways to do this that are valuable, is to create ownership of documentation, also the code, by collaborating on it. So if only one person or only 2 people on your team create this, then it might not, first of all, it might not represent the right view or the right picture of it. And also, the others might never bother to update it because they weren't really part of the process to create this. So documentation is about much more than conveying information to me, and that's what I hope I brought across to you today and maybe gave you some ideas how to change this in the future. And before I really finish, I just want to do a quick plug for my employer, who also supported me coming here today and spending the time here. I'm very happily employed with a software consultancy called Thoughtworks. So if you want to work with me or other lovely people, for example, we just opened a very fast-growing office in Barcelona. It's a very beautiful city. Then check out our website. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions? I was saying before that I won't be able to throw this that far.
I actually have two. The first one is you did not mention any kind of reference documentation, like API reference or programmer manual, stuff like that. Do you have any experience or opinion or advice to share?
So for that, I actually explicitly kept it out and wanted to focus on these other things. That's a whole. It's actually interesting. Like there is a stigma with documentation, but almost every person that I tell that I'm giving a talk about this then has all these things to talk about documentation. So everybody really wants good documentation, but not a lot of people want to create it. So, but yeah, for API documentation, the only thing that comes to mind is that I often see it overused for things that are not even offered as an external API. So if you have, like, let's say, just like a simple web application with a backend, and the same team is maintaining both the front end and the back end, and you generate all this Swagger documentation, and you can't even distinguish anymore which of those endpoints are used just as an internal API by your application and which of those are being exposed, then I sometimes feel like that's a bit of a waste. So you can actually use things like this API documentation to really highlight, like, these are the things that you can expect to be more stable than the others and that we expect others to call. That's the only thing that comes to mind.
Thanks. And the other question is about documentation before and after. So when you talk about an architecture diagram, sometimes maybe during brainstorming or design, you also capture some of those ideas and then you do some implementation and you have some more documentation. And I always feel like it's wasteful that you throw away the design artifacts and you don't keep them around as reference or the other way around. So do you have any experience in terms of reusing what you do during development as reference material or stuff to put
You mean what I mentioned before, like when you have these like raw sketches and then you don't reuse them? Yeah. So in the case of that blurry infographic that I put up, we actually just went to a whiteboard, and initially, usually it's like the whiteboard looks very messy, right? So you don't really know, where do I start? There's this recommendation that you should always start in the middle, but I don't know if that's right. So it usually ends up being like, oh, I should have put this thing there, and now all these arrows go across, but it still helps you find out where you should put everything once you have like a nice picture in the end. So yeah, I don't know. The only recommendation would be to not be afraid of the chaos you might create in the beginning and just embrace it first, then look at what you have and then try to shuffle things around so that it's cleaner. I don't know if that answers the question.
Sure.
Almost. I have a question regarding the complexity you said. So sometimes...
The what, sorry?
The complexity.
Yeah.
So you said sometimes it's nice to, or not nice, maybe it's mandatory to give like a visual presentation of what is going on, especially when you have like things like a state machine or, you know, these things, when you have to describe what is in the core for the new developer. Did you experience something like this, like automate this?
Like so, what, sorry?
Like automate this, because you...
Automate this, yeah.
Yeah, because these things are in the code, so probably you could somehow make a piece of code that you know, runs through a scenario and then makes it. Have you done this before or heard about it?
So I've done some of this in the past, and I think especially for something like a state machine, it might actually be very useful. It seems like whenever I Google for like a good tool to visualize this or that, there's always quite a few tools around where developers build something, but it never feels quite finished. So I haven't really found like a perfect tool for one of these things. I know there's also some stuff to visualize maybe your network and stuff that is going on maybe in your Amazon Web Services account, things like that. So I don't have any tool recommendation. I just have the experience that very often I think it's a good idea to generate it, and then when I generate it, the machine, after all, can still not differentiate between the things that are really important and that give me value and the ones that are not, and then it all ends up a mess. So unfortunately, I haven't found a really good one there yet.
Thanks.
Maybe somebody else has, I don't know.
Hi, I'm very much a back-end developer, not very visual, and you should see the state of my handwriting. What can I do apart from just practicing and getting feedback to improve my visual communication?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a hard one. So I've actually, because I enjoy this so much, I've been thinking a lot about how can I better convey this to others, how to do this. And there's actually, this whole visual thinking thing has become a lot bigger over the past few years. For example, there's visual thinking meetups and stuff like that. And this book by Dan Rome, The Back of the Napkin, is actually also quite nice. And he actually says that, so a lot of people say they can't draw, but he actually divides them into 3 types of people: the black pen, the yellow pen, and the red pen. So the black pen would maybe be the person who goes up and starts drawing stuff. Then the yellow pen type people would come and just highlight things and maybe tweak things a little. And then the red pen are then the people who maybe never wanted to draw in the first place, but then they go and correct stuff. So each of us maybe has something to contribute there, maybe even if you're not the first person to go up and do this. And that's why collaboration is also so important. But yeah, I'm aware that like a lot of people say they're not as visual, they learn differently, and I think that's definitely also something to keep in mind when doing this. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. You say that the team owns the documentation, and what I see is that, for instance, in my current project, there's a notorious very senior guy who was very good at making very complex solutions. I read into that code. I have no idea why he made it, but his team doesn't exist anymore. He doesn't work anymore. So, if the team owns the documentation, how do you handle it when the team isn't there anymore?
So you're talking about a person who creates a lot of complex implementations, and then how do you? Sorry, I'm having like it's.
Yeah. So you say the documentation is from the team. So what if the team isn't there anymore to ask questions to?
Ah, you mean the team is the documentation, like what I said with the team is the guides and yeah.
Yeah.
So the question is if you really get into that situation where the team is all gone within the same day, and there is this. There is unfortunately, of course, this thing that over the lifetime of a project, maybe you don't want to create wasteful documentation, but there might come the day where you hand it over, it won't be maintained for a while, and then maybe in a year somebody else is going to come on, right? So then I think in that case, you probably need to like buckle down and sit there and create some more stuff, because in that moment, it actually creates the value. So in the case especially of those complex solutions, I would maybe repeat what I said before, that if then the rest of the team doesn't really understand it, you can actually also use this to figure out and maybe surface that when you feel like this is very complicated, you can maybe surface that by saying, okay, I don't even know how to describe this to somebody else.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. I think we're out of time and I don't see any more hands, so thank you for joining me.